So, with the fallout of the United Methodist Church, lots of disaffiliations going on, state to state, conference to conference. There's been a lot of movement. A lot of that movement has been behind the scenes. Sometimes I talk about the board of trustees. I talk about individual churches, but a lot of times things escalate to go into court. So I've talked a lot about that in Oklahoma. I've interviewed Lloyd Lunsford, who is a lawyer who specializes in this. I'm still an idiot with respect to all the court proceedings. Last week or the week before, I got a heads up that there was some legal action going on in Pennsylvania with respect to the collective case that the National Center for Life and Liberty was heading up over there. I talked about this some in my coverage of the Eastern Pennsylvania Annual Conference, but the particulars of it were not known to me. And this was not the full case. This was a smaller case pertaining to the full case. And so I have one friend. Actually, I have a couple others in this conference, but Joe DiPaolo has interviewed with me before, and we've gotten his personal story and his insights on the United Methodist Church. He's still proudly within the United Methodist fold, seeking to help the United Methodist Church do well. I knew that there were a lot of people really interested in these legal proceedings, and so I asked him to come on my channel again and explain it in a way that a person of my low intelligence can understand, and maybe you and others will benefit from this as well. So I've been yakking long enough. Joe, thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining me. How are you today, brother?
Doing well, thank you, and thanks for the invitation.
Yes.
Happy to come and keep people informed of us as to what's going on.
Well, anybody who knows who you are knows that you are a diligent person who makes sure that what you say is based in fact and can be backed up. And in this case, we were waiting for the actual court transcript to get released, and you also took good notes. So as people are listening to you, this is not just the recollections of a random guy that's just pulling from what he can get. Right. You've written things down. You've got it in writing. So people, you can really lean on Joe's account in this time. So if you're interested in Joe and who he is and why I like him, I would ask you to go find my video that I already produced with him. We're going to get right into it if you're okay with that, Joe. Just
Sure.
tell us basically what was the case about, how long did it take, what's the good broad view that you think people should know about?
So I'm not a party to the case. I'm not a part of any of the proceedings or part of the lawsuit. Neither is my church. But I decided I wanted to go and witness the proceedings at the court for several reasons. Some of my friends were involved and are testifying. I wanted to support them. And also, I've been kind of one of the chief conference historians for 20 years. So I thought, this is historic. I should be there. So I guess I'm kind of in the place of a reporter here. Mm-hmm. So the big picture is that about 50 churches in the Eastern Penn Conference have engaged the attorneys of NCLL, National Center for Life and Liberty, to represent them. Last year, their attempt was to try to negotiate an alternative way out of the conference than using the Eastern PA's very labyrinthine disaffiliation process. They've had actually some meetings with the bishop, but they've gone nowhere. And so I think sometime in the last 2 months, they filed a notice to file, which means they've officially notified the court and the conference that they plan to sue, but have not done so yet. But that gives them the ability to start the discovery process, to be able to get information. In the meantime, 11 of those 50 churches basically have run out of patience. They've said, this is dragging on forever. It looks like it's going to drag on forever. We just want out. So they asked the conference, I know one large church specifically wrote the bishop and said, listen, even though we don't think it's fair, even though we think it's onerous and burdensome, we'll pay the price if you just let us out. So give us a chance to take the vote, have the conference vote on us, and let us out before 2553 expires at the end of the year. The conference refused. So this particular hearing last week was not about the big picture suit. It was the attorneys for the 11 of the 50 churches asking the judge to issue an injunction to compel the annual conference to allow them to take a disaffiliation vote and then have it ratified or not by the conference before the end of the year, before it expires. So that's what this was about.
Okay.
The larger lawsuit is, I guess, yet to come, assuming it does go through.
So let me revisit some of the pieces of that for viewers that aren't as into this as me and you. The starting place was the broader NCLL lawsuit where the 50 churches stated that the annual conference 2553 disaffiliation policy was unnecessarily onerous. Can you
Mhm.
speak to any of the specifics of the Board of Trustees disaffiliation plan that is unfair, that would be grounds, whether or not you agree with them personally, grounds for them filing the
Mhm.
suit?
Well, that actually did come up in the hearings because, and maybe I can do that as a part of describing what happened.
Hmm.
One of the issues that the conference attorneys kept objecting to was when the plaintiffs' attorneys, those for the 11 churches, kept trying to bring up some of these issues from the underlying suit because they kept saying, well, that's not relevant today.
Hmm.
But the plaintiffs' attorneys kept, yes, they are, because they're showing the harm that is to be averted by having this injunction offered. So, so that, and part of what they tried to show was that the process that the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference put in place was actually prevented a proper implementation of 2553. But I think that'll probably unfold as we get into some of the arguments.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I knew that was the final question I wanted to ask, but another clarification I wanted to make was
Mhm.
this discovery process. A lot of people don't know or what that means, or at least I didn't until 6 months ago. That's a process where both sides in the case get to dig into each other's correspondences,
Right,
emails,
right,
look for dirt on the other side, and the other side has to give it up. And from
right.
state to state, the things that are dug up in that process, some of those states, like Georgia, you cannot share. Other
Mhm.
states, you can share publicly whatever
Right.
is learned in the discovery process. And so that's something I'm a big fan of as an advocate of transparency.
Transparency. You
Oh,
bet.
absolutely. And so I'm all in favor of the churches being exposed and their private correspondences, but also the bishop, board of trustees, all of them being exposed for, some people who they are in public is exactly who they are in private. Some people, it's
Mhm.
exactly the opposite, and you don't know that
Right,
until you see the private
right.
correspondences. So that sounds like a promising thing to us. For those who are on pins and needles, it is important right now to go ahead and let people know a decision has not been made yet. The judge at the end
Correct.
of these 2 days of proceedings said it's too much to rule on right now. I'm going to
Mhm.
release this text of the proceedings, and then I will rule later after I've had more time to think on it. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, at the end of the proceedings,
Hmm.
he said that in case they were hoping for a ruling from the bench right there,
Hmm.
he felt that the issues were too complex and that he actually ordered the proceedings, the transcript for himself to refer to.
Okay.
And,
Okay.
but as a result, it went to both parties. And so the attorneys then were able to give it to some of their clients, and
Excellent.
I managed to get a copy. So
Yeah, that's fun. That's fun.
I
The
just
other
came this morning, so I didn't get a chance to really dig into it,
Right. Yeah. Well, if
but
we need to issue a correction later based on something in writing, we
yeah,
can do that. So,
sure.
the
But they
other,
were,
go ahead.
yeah, like I said, as I witnessed it and as I started looking through my notes and things, it seems like there were three basic issues that the court was being asked to rule on. The first, the most basic one, was whether or not it had any jurisdiction at all on First Amendment grounds. This is freedom of religion. If the court, courts tend to very much not want to in any way insert themselves into internal church disputes that touch on doctrine or spirituality. That's not their business.
Let me lay just real quick groundwork.
Yeah,
In Oklahoma, what happened was two churches filed against the annual conference, asking the court to use neutral principles
right.
in interpreting paragraph 2553 and alleging that the annual conference had violated the clear meaning of paragraph 2553. And they were just asking the state to compel the annual conference to abide by the clear rules of 2553. Is it exactly the same in
It's
Pennsylvania?
pretty much this. That's pretty much the argument that was being used by the attorneys for the
Okay.
11 churches.
Okay.
The conference attorneys were arguing that it was an internal church matter, and that the court should, not just should dismiss it, not be involved at all. The attorneys for the churches said, well, we know that the court does certainly have jurisdiction on
Mm,
some. Not every dispute in a church is an internal matter pertaining to their doctrines. I mean, you can have disputes over employment, sexual harassment.
yeah.
You can have lawsuits over property issues. And they quoted some Pennsylvania court decisions, including a Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So that that's a key issue. If the judge determines he doesn't have jurisdiction, then that's the end of it.
Mhm.
If he does, and I suspect he will, I don't know, then whether or not he rules in the favor, whoever he rules in favor of with regard to the injunction, that will be important going forward for the larger lawsuit, I would think, if he
Yeah.
says he does have jurisdiction.
So if the 11 churches that are wanting to withdraw from the NCLL lawsuit and just go through this,
Mhm.
I like the word labyrinthine process, then if the judge rules in their favor, then Bishop Scholl, the Board of Trustees, the annual conference is compelled to let them exit under whatever the process is that they have designed for 2553 before the end of the year. Would it be right to conclude that?
Well, that gets into the other two issues they have
Okay, let's do it.
has to decide.
Yeah.
So the first issue is whether or not they have jurisdiction. So
Okay.
they could decide they do, but still not give these 11 churches what they want. So the second issue had to do with whether or not the Book of Discipline constituted a legal contract
Yes.
between the hierarchy and the members in the churches.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the conference was arguing no, it does not. They kept using the phrase it's church law, it's not a contract. The attorneys for the 11 churches were arguing that in fact it does constitute a legal contract. And again, they cited some case law on that as well. And if it's a contract, then it can come under contract law, and those so-called neutral principles can then apply.
Right.
Are they living up to the contract terms or not? And what kind of redress is there for that? So that was the second issue. And then the third one is what you alluded to. If it is a contract, then is the conference fulfilling the terms of that contract properly, or are they not? And what kind of remedies can be found for that, which includes the judge potentially issuing an injunction and compelling the conference to allow them to take their vote and have it acted on by conference before the end of the year.
That would be interesting.
Those are three basic things that I glean were the heart of it.
In Oklahoma, the district judge who initially entertained the cases ruled in favor of the churches and mandated very unforeseen courses of actions to redress what had.
I remember that.
And then that's why it went to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. So this deals with a lot of. Do you imagine that even if the court rules in favor of the 11 churches, do you get the sense that the conference would then appeal that to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, do you think?
Can't say. I don't know. If it is as radical a decision as what happened in Oklahoma, they might well want to do that. If it's kind of a split thing where the judge kind of gives both of them something, but each of them not exactly what they want, they might decide, both sides might decide not to go there because on appeal, they could lose everything. So I don't know.
The other thing I knew I wanted to ask you before we get into the nitty-gritty of the case is it seems to me that there are a number of instances in the unfolding of these chapters around disaffiliation that conferences have learned that it really works to their benefit to just kick the can down the road and delay. It seems to have a demoralization impact, and it seems that local churches really lack the stamina to confidently go forward when the future is uncertain.
I think you're right.
Am I right to interpret these 11 churches dropping out from the NCLL case probably being a direct consequence of the conference slowballing all this?
I think there's something to that. I think there are people in those churches I have heard that are losing patience and threatening to leave.
Yeah.
This thing keeps dragging on. They want out. They want to move forward. And so I think that the congregations are feeling that those particular congregations feeling that even if it's going to cost them more money now, it's better than waiting a year, 2 years as this thing drags through the courts.
Yeah. Yeah, very practical short-term concerns. And then part of the theological reality is not many United Methodist churches are wartime bodies. They're peacetime bodies. And so whenever it comes time to do spiritual battle, they're just not equipped for a long, protracted competition in this sense. So it worked for the benefit of the conference in this sense. And then if the court does not rule in the favor of these 11 churches, then are they going to go back into the NCLL group and continue?
I assume so. I don't think there'd be any other. I mean, it's possible they could drop out entirely, but that would still go forward, I would think.
Are they still considered part of the NCLL group? Do you know?
Yeah, they're still being represented by them.
Interesting. Okay. So then there's the nitty gritty of the case where there's a proceeding. It was over 2 days, wasn't it?
Yeah, which surprised me. I heard it was they were filing for an injunction. I assumed it was just going to be a few arguments by the attorneys on each side, file some papers, and everybody goes home. But they wound up being there for 2 days. 5 witnesses were called,
Mm,
including the bishop,
hmm.
who spent probably 4 hours or longer on the stand, which was interesting to watch.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it really was something. Also, the courtroom on day one was packed,
Mm.
and apparently that does not happen. The judge remarked on that at the end that we're not used to seeing very many people seated here at all. And he thanked them for behaving well, which everybody was told, don't, if you act up, they're going to throw you out. So
Why do you
he
think
was
the turnout
behaving.
was so big?
I think there's a lot of people who are really concerned about it. A lot of the members and leaders of the churches involved came, and some additional witnesses from the conference came. All the superintendents were there, other conference officials. So I think everybody wanted to make a good showing, I suppose, to say that this is important and these are real lives. I think that's one of the things. Sometimes I I, I don't know. I'm not an attorney. I have a brother who's an attorney. So, but
I'm sorry, Joe.
yeah. Well, sometimes they can get so caught up in the legalities and the niceties of the law
Yeah.
that they need to be reminded real people's lives
Yeah.
are being affected by
Hmm.
this, and that's a way to really drive that home.
Hmm. Hmm. So I'm interested in your profile of the judge, the two lawyers, and then the witnesses. So go in whatever order you like. I'm just very interested in the personalities.
Sure. Well, the judge, Judge Jeffrey Saltz was his name, and this was held in the Montgomery County Courthouse in Norristown, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Philadelphia, a city outside of Philly. Um, and the judge seemed to me very fair. He was clearly not a Methodist, or clearly didn't really understand the Methodist system, because he has a lot of questions about how it worked. In fact, at one point, directly questioned the bishop when on the stand, which was very interesting. We can get back into that later. But he seemed to me to be very fair. He bent over backwards to give a lot of leeway to both sides. There were a lot of objections that were raised by one set of lawyers or the other, and my recollection is most of the time he overruled them and let people go. Even if he said, "I'm not so sure this is relevant, but I'm going to let him go,"
Hmm.
because I think he wanted maximum information, and I think he was trying to be very fair and listen.
Hmm.
So that seemed to be very positive.
And then
So,
counsel for the conference.
so counsel for the conference were people I'm not aware of. I guess they were. It was not the conference attorney. So they brought in some local attorneys. One's name is Ray McGarry. The other was a woman named Mary Kay Brown.
Do you know if they represented a very large firm?
I do not know what their firm was. That's a good
See,
question. I do
in
not.
Oklahoma, they hired the biggest law firm in the state. So that
That would
made
be interesting to follow up on.
yeah, that made a statement here. I wonder if that is a commonality. So how did they comport themselves in the courtroom?
I think all the attorneys, they were all very professional. They were making their cases. Yeah, I wouldn't. I think they were all doing their jobs, representing their clients.
Okay. And that goes for was it Gibbs that represented the 11
So
churches?
this was interesting. The plaintiffs of the 11 churches, they had two attorneys. They had a local counsel, and they had David Gibbs from the NCLL.
Hmm.
The local counsel was Bruce Castor. That's a name that people might actually remember. He's a former district attorney for Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and he testified in the second Trump impeachment trial.
Okay.
So he got some national news coverage at that. He's actually a college classmate of mine. Interestingly enough,
Small world, man.
yeah, it really is. Um,
So did one of
so
them take lead or
they took turns. They both took turns asking questions, and Gibbs clearly was much more well schooled in the particulars of Methodist polity than Bruce was, but they both did able work.
Okay, so there were in the court proceedings there was no consistent presence that was inept or toxic. Everybody was consummate professionals.
Yeah, and that was the one that's interesting because you put it that way, because I thought about this. And most of the times these disputes that we've been having, they tend to happen in annual conference settings, or they happen in local church settings, or maybe there's a gathering of clergy. This was a very different setting in which neither side got to control what was going on. You
That's
know,
fun.
the bishop did not get to control the agenda or to control the narrative, or And I don't think he's used to being in that position.
Well, yeah, for anybody who didn't see
Yeah,
I did a
yeah,
3-part series on I don't think it was, I think you've had an annual conference since then, but it was the conference session from several months ago. I did a
right.
3-part series kind of showing, I've been very concerned about your bishop's exercise of power and authority in the body. There are many times that he looks very libertine in handing it out, but I noticed that he was very controlled in giving time and space to different voices and then using them to different effect to further his own agenda. But whether or not you agree with that personal assessment, the environment you're describing here did not fit with the bishop's usual power
No,
dynamic.
it was the judge's courtroom. He was the guy in charge.
And he
And
was gracious and magnanimous, but he also
Mhm.
had a firm hand on the wheel.
Yep. It was very interesting to watch that. So that, clearly Bishop Scholl was not comfortable being in that position. There were a couple times when he got a little snippy, which was interesting. At one point, one of the lawyers asked him about having a quote clean 2553, and he said, "I don't know what you mean by that," as opposed to a dirty 2553. So so
I'd probably
but
respond the same way in fairness, but I mean, it's also one of the things that I know from talking to you briefly before was a pretty consistent thing that the bishop said on the stand in the total 4 hours that he was up there was that he was not assuming responsibility for the crafting or implementation of the disaffiliation policy, but he
that,
instead put that on the board of trustees. Is that right?
well, I think what was interesting. First of all, Bishop Scholl is a very smart man. He was a very formidable witness. He was very good at what I would say staying on message, and his message essentially was, "My duty as a bishop is to simply implement the discipline and implement the policies of the conference board of trustees. I can't do any less. I can't do any more."
Mm-hmm.
That was his basic argumentation. And the second argument was that we had a process that was fair, open to all churches. These churches opted not to enter it. The deadline's passed. It's too late. It's done, and it can't be done now for them. Now he said it much more nicely than that, but
Mm-hmm.
that was essentially his basic argument. Um, and as I said, he was very formidable. He was not going to give up anything he did not have to. Um, One of the questions that kept coming back again and again from the plaintiff's attorney, the 11 churches, was, can this get done by the end of the year? Can this actually happen? Can these churches take their vote? Can the conference be called? And he just refused to say yes, because he kept insisting that the conference policy had to be followed, and that would take many more months, require multiple votes. There's a lot that has to be done.
He
Um,
refused to answer that question.
he refused to give a clear answer to it to the attorneys. But then
And
later in the proceedings on
okay.
day 2, the judge began to question him directly
Yeah.
and asked him at one point and said, "Is it physically possible to get this done by December 31st?" And he said yes. And he had to at that point. So, but he insisted that if to do so would mean he'd have to violate the discipline and violate
Okay.
his responsibilities and all that kind of stuff.
Yes. But hypothetically, it could be
Could be done.
done. Okay.
Right.
Well, that's a good thing.
But
I really enjoyed Judge Timmons here in Oklahoma asking witnesses things directly. I would hate it if only the lawyers, who often are too close to it to see what needs to be asked. I love when a judge gets involved and asks the right questions, and it sounds like yours was insightful. And it really is, it's a disadvantage sometimes not to know a structure you're ruling on, but other times an outsider perspective can really be helpful, especially if you're looking at neutral principles law and you're just looking at how the English language is applied cross institutionally. That can be a very helpful perspective that Methodists don't have because we're so into our own world. So,
right.
so the
But getting
bishop.
back to
Go
your
ahead.
question
Yeah.
about responsibility, he didn't deny responsibility, but what he tried, it seemed to me he was trying to portray himself as almost not involved in the process. So, for example, at one point, I think I can find the wording here. One of the attorneys said something about, if these churches vote to disaffiliate, you can call a special session of conference either by Zoom or in person to deal with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
He said, "No, I don't have that authority." And they said, "Well, who does?" He said, "Well, the annual conference can do that, or the cabinet can do that." And they said, "Well, the cabinet, you mean your district superintendents, aren't you their boss?" And he says, "I'm not their boss. Don't they work for you?" He said, "They work for God," which was interesting. And then finally, he said, "I'm their supervisor." And of course, anyone in the system knows the district superintendents, they work at the pleasure of the bishop. They're
Mm-hmm.
appointed by the bishop. They're going to follow his lead. If he wants a special session called, they're going to say yes. If he
Hmm.
doesn't, they're going to say no.
Hmm.
But it's just odd that he tried to distance himself that way. And the other one had to do with the trustees. They were talking about the process that the conference board of trustees had set up, and at one point the attorney referred to it as your process to the bishop, and he said it's not my process; it's the board of trustees process. They came up with this. Again, it seemed like he was trying to distance himself again, as though he had nothing to do with it. And of course, we know that he did, especially since it was pointed out at another point in the proceedings that the previous bishop, Bishop Johnson, had overseen the disaffiliation of one church, a progressive church, and that was in a very informal process as they negotiated with the trustees and was done very amicably and very smoothly. And he also, on the stand, Bishop Scholl said that one of the first things he did when he came into the conference was to meet with the trustees and said they need to formalize their process. And when they did, out came this huge thing that so many churches found so difficult to meet.
Yeah.
So I thought that was curious.
Well,
He seemed to try to
when
distance
they're
himself.
moving pieces that can put responsibility on each other, then it just becomes very difficult to figure out a remedy to the problem. So it makes sense as to why they would do that, but it also to a person like me with my disposition, it just conveys dishonesty and trying to get one over on these churches that they have authority. So yeah, in Oklahoma, it turned into, well, we have the authority to do these things, so we're going to, which was really quite upsetting for someone like me who goes, man, you're really supposed to be morally responsible, regardless of whether or not you have authority to do something. You should.
Sure.
But then the other thing that happened in the Supreme Court case that was really unfortunate was the counsel for the conference alleged that the timeline and the power structure did allow for these churches to seek redress without filing suit in court, which was false. It was not true. But it seemed that the Supreme Court justices did not read their briefs and they didn't know that was true. And for some reason, the counsel for the churches did not come back to that and correct that. And so I
Interesting.
wondered how much that factored into their final decision. What are some, there were, I think you said, four other witnesses.
Right.
Were any of them of substance?
Oh
And
yeah,
go
yeah, there
ahead.
was a lot there. But you might want to back up because I think that same issue came up about the timeline. That
Yeah.
was a big issue that
Yeah.
they
You
talked
brought that up
about,
a second ago. Yeah.
which the attorneys for the churches they pointed out that the 2553 had been passed in February 2020. Sorry, February of 2019.
Hmm.
The conference did not have a spelled out policy until the late spring of 2022.
Hmm.
And then the churches had only until September of that year to make up their minds, and they didn't get all the information until, in some cases, till August to decide whether or not to enter into the process. So they, and of course, September of 2022 is a year and 4 months, a year and 3 months. There's still left as far as the discipline is concerned before it
Hmm.
sunsets. So they were arguing that that timeline was itself a way of preventing the churches from being able to exercise what they said was a property right granted to them under the discipline. That was one of the terms they used, that the 2553 granted a powerful property right, and they were trying to show that the conference was setting up a system that was depriving them of that, of the ability to exercise that right,
Yeah, and you would think
which
that would
was
be a slam dunk since
yeah.
in 2553 it says that they have a right, a limited right to disaffiliate. The limitations being the explicit provisions
And
in
it,
2553. But even
right.
so, in Oklahoma, they were very scared away by the possibility that anything theological was involved in this. To
Mhm.
them, it just became, this has First Amendment implications, even tangentially, we're out. So we're not going to look at this as a property dispute because the whole thing that sets it in motion is a theological issue. And so they kind of ruled from cowardice. The council for the churches was pretty certain that they were wrong in doing so. But that's for another conversation somewhere else.
Yeah.
It sounds like you guys got a fair hearing. Well, you guys. It sounds like the church gave a fair hearing to both sides. I'm curious if there were any other salient moments in the courtroom, or if everything was really pretty humdrum.
I wouldn't say it was humdrum. There were a lot of interesting moments. So the other witnesses who testified included two pastors under appointment, testifying essentially against their own bishop, which was interesting.
So they're still
Um,
serving. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, in the UMC,
Oh my.
um, and uh, their testimony had to do with how their church came to. One of the things at issue was, and this could have been made clearer, I think, by the attorneys, but the conference kept insisting upon the discernment process. But it was a discernment process as dictated by the conference. And I think they were trying to show that these churches had their own ways of discerning what they wanted to do, and they decided what they wanted. But a lot was made of the term sheets. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. I guess you would be. So the 2553 says that the church is to vote on whether it wants not to disaffiliate, and then the conference is to let them know what that cost is going to be. That's the term sheet. What are the terms?
Oh, right. Yes.
So
Yes.
In Eastern Pennsylvania, what they did is they decided to issue a preliminary term sheet in advance of congregations taking their vote. And that was explained by Bishop Scholl as being a gracious thing that would give them all the information they needed to, as they were deliberating. The other side say, no, that what that really was a scare tactic.
Because the number was so high.
Right.
Yeah.
And to buttress that, what they did with a number of these witnesses is have them talk about what their term sheets were. And also they brought up information about term sheets of there were 5 churches that did go through the process and were disaffiliated by conference vote last May. And one of the witnesses was a lay leader of one of our very small churches who got up and testified. And a small church up along the Delaware River, I think their total annual budget was $90,000 or so. And the initial term sheet was about the same as their total annual budget. But after they went through the whole process, it wound up getting reduced to the $30,000 range, like almost, 2/3 of it were knocked off.
Oh, wow.
The same also happened with another one, a large church that disaffiliated, New Hanover Church. Their initial term sheet was $1.5 million. It got knocked down to about $1 million by the time they left. So the allegations that these were inflated numbers that were designed to scare the churches off, and something like 23 or 25 churches initially tried to begin the process, and all but 5 dropped out.
Wow. Because of those numbers, ostensibly.
Well, that was the inference, yeah. And among other things. And another thing that they tried to bring up was, and this has to do with that third piece of what the judge has to rule on, did the conference fairly and properly implement 2553? They brought up the experience of the other 2 conferences in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has 3 conferences: Western PA, Susquehanna, which used to be called Central PA, and Eastern PA. Not real creative in the names there, but so while Bishop Scholl was on the stand, he was asked, "Are you familiar with how many churches disaffiliated in Western PA?" He said, "Yes, about 300. That's about right." "Are you familiar with what happened in Central PA or Susquehanna?" "Yes, about 125 to 150 churches." "And how many disaffiliated in Eastern PA?" 5. So that was taken, and the attorneys then said that right there suggests that there's something very different about Eastern Pennsylvania's process that made it much more difficult for churches to be able to exercise their right than in the other 2 conferences in the state. So there were a lot of arguments that they were bringing to bear that I think are going to come out more detail in the subsequent case if it gets there. So that was really interesting to see these, to hear from these witnesses. But it was also interesting to hear from the witnesses about the internal workings of the congregations and their care and how they were turned off to what was going on in the conference. And that it wasn't just, and this was another thing, that the whole issues of same-sex marriage and gay ordination, yeah, that's been the trigger for all of this. There's no doubt that's been the trigger, but is that really the heart of the issue? And one of the pastors said for their church, it really was deeper than that. It was about the fact that the conference and the church, the United Methodist Church in general, is moving towards tolerating more and more of a sort of religious pluralism approach to Christianity. And that's not where their church wants to go. And that those issues about sexuality are just markers on that deeper issue. And he actually was, he cited, every year we have to fill out forms, clergy and churches, about appointment time, right?
Oh, sure, yeah.
And the conference came out with a new form last year, the year before, and it had 5 different categories of how you would characterize your theology. The first 3 were all what I would say reasonably within, Orthodox Christianity, but the last one pretty much was a sort of pluralistic, religious approach.
Yeah,
denied the uniqueness of salvation in Christ, and he really talked about that as being much more at the heart of why he and his church want to leave, because that is where they see the denomination going.
And
And
did the
that's,
judge seem at all receptive to that, or did you just feel like he was kind of because it obviously doesn't fall in any kind of explicit sense into the language of 2553 or anything else?
right.
Did was a bit the judge just gracious and letting, or did it seem like he found that like a worthy way to spend time?
As I recall, he was just listening. I don't think he did
Okay.
a whole lot of talking at that point.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
interesting that they gave room for that kind of argument to be
Yeah.
made, but whenever you're talking about neutral principles and contract law, you can't talk about the real thing underneath. You can only talk about the language that's there, which is unfortunate because 2553 is the only mechanism for exiting the denomination, and it only provides one very narrow reason for doing it, and it's just fundamentally unjust. But we can't litigate that here and now. The main thing I think here and now is people in other conferences who are considering legal action, especially as we reach the sunset of 2553, just kind of doing the cost benefit analysis of state law as it relates to First Amendment versus neutral principles, sort of stuff in the local church. Did you see much that really seemed to get traction in the courtroom or with the judge in particular, so far as making the case for why it was that state involvement was needed?
Well, there was an interesting incident that happened at the very end that maybe had an impression on the judge. So I think I mentioned that everybody was very well behaved in the peanut gallery, as it were. At the very end, as the attorneys were making their closing arguments, um, the female attorney for the conference was actually kind of taking aim at one of the arguments made by the other side, trying to kind of mock them, saying, the attorneys for these churches are making it seem as though the conference pulled some kind of big bait and switch, and we're just trying to scare people out of the process. And at that point, for the first time in the 2 days, an audible murmur went through the whole crowd, with people shaking their heads and saying, yes, yes, it's exactly what it was. And it startled her for a moment. She stopped for a moment before she went on. And I can't imagine that would not have made some kind of an impression, that at least is the perception of the people in the pews
Yeah, I
that were
wonder
there to
how
support it.
common that. So, well, already you've said it's not very common for that many people to show up for such a thing anyway. But then to have all the normies have this collective experience that they're able to, at that quick notice, respond with that level of intensity and clarity. That really is. I can't imagine that happens very often.
No, no. So it's interesting to see where it's going to go.
Yeah.
I don't know how they're going to rule. It may wind up going some of the same paths that it did in Oklahoma. Every state's different in terms of their laws. But I think that I heard from my friends that the attorneys for the churches felt that it went well from their perspective. They got
Good.
out most of what they wanted to get out.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I say good. I'm not a neutral observer here. I'm not.
right.
I'm not aiming for impartiality. I think that the way the United Methodist Church leadership has implemented 2553 is just overtly corrupt. And yeah, I do have concerns about Bishop Scholl, and I feel bad about that because when I had my birthday on Facebook, he wrote "Happy Birthday" on my timeline. I just thought that was really sweet. But even so, I got issues with the way things have been going on. I really feel for you guys in Eastern Pennsylvania. It doesn't sound like I read what's her face's "People Throw Rocks at Things That Shine."
Yeah.
I'm
Beth Caulfield. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. I read her account of doing ministry there, and it sounds like it's just been a place where I would have flunked out, So you're not complaining, you're not saying anything negative about the conference, but you have a stake in continuing to serve your conference well, and I think it's a credit to you that you had the patience to show up and give it a fair listen.
It's tragic that it came to that it had to come to that, and we couldn't find a more. And to me, that's the tragedy. Is that I was a delegate in 2019 in St. Louis, and I remember when 2553 was passed. That was not the first choice of a lot of us. It was a secondary choice. There was a previous motion for a different kind of disaffiliation clause, but the intent was for it to allow a gracious exit. At that time, we were thinking for the progressive churches.
Right.
Remember, they just passed the traditional plan, and the feeling was we don't want to force people
Right.
to stay in a denomination that goes against their conscience. Let's let them find a gracious way out.
Well, and it's important for
turned,
people to remember nobody knew the cost that would be associated with the unfunded pension liabilities.
Right.
So it
Right.
was not this kind of ham-fisted, we'll do
Right.
you a favor and let you go, but you got to pay out the nose. That's what it became later as these actuarials were actually revealed. But the intent behind it really was gracious from
Right.
a prevailing traditional majority towards a minority that they knew would want to leave. It was supposed to be very gracious. Had it worked out differently, and these actuarials were much higher than, I can't imagine that the conservatives would say, pay out the nose. I really do think that people act as though left and right are the same, and if the situations were reversed, they would do the same thing. And I'm not ever going to make the case that the right is pure and perfect and would be perfectly virtuous, but I really have a hard time imagining the right-leaning evangelical voices that were in the United Methodist Church behaving in the way that the prevailing centrist and leftist people in power have. And
Well,
so,
it was the majority. It was the conservative majority in St. Louis that passed that disaffiliation
yes,
paragraph and made it even possible. So I think that supports what you're saying,
yeah,
some. But
yeah,
so it's not just the actuarial method they use, which of course a lot of us have questioned, because we think they don't need to collect nearly as much as they are
right,
collecting to keep
yes,
the program solvent. But it's the fact that many conferences like ours have heaped on additional costs to
hmm
the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
hmm
And in some conferences, as you know, California, Baltimore, Washington, they've added, property valuation payments as
yeah,
well,
yeah,
50%.
Calpac, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The WCA, what's his name, Glenn
Yeah.
Hayworth, posted
Yeah.
something saying to pay out every single one of the constituents of his church would have to pay like $50,000,
Right.
which
Something
is
crazy. Yeah.
asinine.
Which
Yeah.
is right. Right.
So
Yep.
it's a big picture. The ironic thing. I'm hopefully again. I've been talking about reporting on Rio, Texas for forever, but in that case, the situation's been reversed, where the conference filed against these churches, asking the state to compel them to abide by 2553. And
I'm
so,
not familiar with that.
yeah.
Interesting.
It's really weird.
Huh.
Hopefully, I'll put out a report here soon.
Huh.
And of
Yeah.
course, Texas is a little different as regards deference to ecclesiastical authorities. But we'll see what happens there. But, a lot of this state law is currently getting figured out. If you saw my interview with Lloyd Lunsford, he thinks that American legal precedent is going to shift to meet the
Hmm.
need here of local churches. How quick, he didn't say how quickly or what would be
Right.
needed to do that, but it does seem as though the religious landscape is shifting. And then
No
where
doubt.
Eastern Pennsylvania fits in that is anybody's best guess. Do you have any kind of guess so far as a timeline on this particular case?
No. When the judge said he would rule as soon as practical, we all kind of thought, well, a few days, a week. It's been a week now and nothing. I did hear from a friend in Baltimore, Washington, that they had a similar kind of a case in mid September, and they still haven't heard. I hope it doesn't take that long because the clock's ticking. 2553 is going to expire very, very soon,
And
and I
is there
think that's.
anything to say about the larger NCLL lawsuit and the timeline there, or is all that up in the
I
air?
don't. I don't think I know enough to be able to speak to that, but
Okay.
I do think, as I recall from the hearings, I think one of the attorneys said that that's something that would only become, I guess, relevant after December 31st, when
Mm.
when that now is expired. So probably in the new year
Some annual
they would.
conferences have utilized paragraph 2549 as an additional exit provision where they simply close churches.
Right.
And then some, I want to say South Carolina and one
Yeah, I think it's South
other.
Carolina and West Virginia, I think, are the two. And that
Right.
actually came up in the court case
Okay.
with Bishop Scholl,
Uh-huh.
and he was questioned about other avenues out, and that did come up as a possibility. And he said the 2449 could be used to close the church, but then sell it back to the congregation at market value. And I don't think they want to do that. And of course, we both know that that's not. They don't have to sell it at market value. In
No.
fact, we know in Eastern Penn Conference itself, I have two examples from recent years where that was done and it was not anywhere near market value. In fact, in one case, it was for $1 that it was sold. So they could use 2449, and they could choose to be gracious if they wish to. But that doesn't seem to be the mood right now.
Yeah, that was my question, was how likely that would seem at this point. And I'm wondering, once the reason I brought that up is once 2553 finally sunsets and the reality that all these churches are trapped, I'm wondering if any of them are going to be able to organize and just mandate that their conferences create a new process through 2549, or if they're just going to be so disparaged that they walk away from their buildings and assets and let them all have it. So that's the next
I think both of
question.
those things will happen. There's
Yeah.
also, I'm sure there is. You had the interview with fellow from Alaska,
Yeah, Lonnie Brooks.
Lonnie Brooks.
Yeah.
You know that they're proposing. He, among others, are proposing that a new 2553 or something like it be adopted by the General Conference in Charlotte next May. Now, I don't think the bishops will be inclined to favor that, but I think they will be able to make a good argument that there's an injustice that none of the rest of the church around the world has had the same opportunity.
Yeah.
So it could be that they find another avenue that gets put in place after that.
There's just got to be. I mean, unless they put 2948.2 back into effect, which of course was ruled null and void whenever 2553 was enacted. I mean, if you don't have a pressure release valve, things blow. That is not in the institutional interest to have no way out. So I'm hopeful that voices like Lonnie's will prevail and reason will. It's been really interesting in Oklahoma as the release valve worked and over 100 churches have left. The group dynamic in their gatherings, the temperature has gone down. And so I would like to think that as individual conferences experience this and some of these bishops experience it, come back to each other, that they realize having a release valve is in the institutional interest. It's more fun. Anyway, that'll be for another segment. This was about you in Pennsylvania. Is there anything else pertaining to your context in that court case that you think is important for outsiders to know about?
What was interesting to me was that the conference was very much focused on legal matters, process, bureaucratic structures. There wasn't a lot of, and I know it was a court, but there wasn't much discussion about like what are you about? What's your whole purpose? What's your mission as a church of God? And this really hit me powerfully at the end when I mentioned the judge at one point was directly questioning Bishop Scholl. And part of it was just to understand the Methodist system better. And at one point he asked, well, what's a bishop's role? What does a bishop do? And Bishop Scholl's answer was entirely about authority and structure. Talking about, he had testified earlier using the analogy of the American system of government. The bishops are like the executive branch that administer. The General Conference is like the legislative, and we have a judicial branch as well. But I sat there and think, my first answer would have been, a bishop's job is to be the spiritual leader of his people. Bishop's job is to articulate and defend the faith. But he didn't go near that. That struck me as both kind of puzzling and revealing at the same time, because I wonder if that's how a lot of our leaders think. They think in just bureaucratic terms.
This is something that the Global Methodist Church is going to be dealing with as well, because for so long, Christian leadership has been married to CEO and corporate culture, growth and marketing and communications, all these things that really have nothing to do with Jesus being married to the role of the executive pastor in these different. So these things, we act as though they fit together. I remember Caulfield remarked on this in her account of working with Bishop Scholl, that he was regularly reading all kinds of administration and organization books and liked all these different theories and models of group dynamics. But as you read about that, there's a huge difference between that and then the ideal Christian leader that you want to follow, who has a rich prayer life and builds relationships with Christ at the center. It's just a very different model of what Christian leadership looks like that evangelicals rightly took issue with in the United Methodist Church. And then the church more broadly in America. This is something, corporate culture really did a number on the church, man. So, I want to exercise sympathy with Bishop Scholl as much as I can, because broadly I'm unsympathetic with him. But he's been given a big task at hand, and it doesn't seem to be going particularly well. Do you feel like he exited that courtroom feeling like he did a good job and he was victorious and the judge would be a moron to rule against them? Or do you think that, no? Okay.
I'm not sure I can read the man.
Yeah.
I think by any measure, he himself did a good job advocating for his side on the stand. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah.
But how the judge will rule, you never know.
Well, okay, I want to hypothetically give a more charitable picture to Scholl, where he just knows he's appearing before a worldly person that's going to litigate the case, and so he doesn't expect this worldly person to value any of that Christ, Jesus, mumbo jumbo stuff. He's just going to talk about practical worldly things that he understands. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead.
Although if their argument is that this is all about an internal spiritual doctrinal matter, I would think that would be a good reason to talk about that stuff specifically.
Oh, yeah, he might have wanted to lean into that. Yeah, I don't know that I would have thought about that in that scenario, but yeah, that's really smart. Oh, yes, this is far beyond you, Judge. Here, let me talk to you about Christian doctrine until you shut me up. Yeah, that would be quite a strategy there, but that's not what they did. So, all right, well, we've done a pretty good job on this. Do you feel like there's anything else that responsible people would need to hear about before we cut this thing off?
No, I don't think so. That's probably enough to give people a general overview. And when we hear, I'm sure you'll be among the first to let folks know.
Right on. Okay. Well, I'm going to let the audience know. I think that Joe is an excellent voice. I've asked him privately to consider doing a series with me, and if you think that he is a good mind to consult, you might just leave in the comments that you think Joe DiPaolo is a good voice that's worthy of consulting more. Maybe he'll feel some pressure to say yes to me. You should really check out what Joe's been a part of in the past. He's an excellent historian. He's an excellent systems, big picture guy, but also clearly gifted in the pulpit. And clearly, I interviewed Rob Renfro last week. He's sticking with the United Methodist Church to help it be its best self, and this is obviously where Joe is as well. And so if you as viewers want to know how to pray, of course, pray for the churches and the conference caught up in this lawsuit, but also pray for people like Joe and Rob Renfro, people who are sticking with the United Methodist Church and who are going to be maligned and spoken ill of, but who are going to serve faithfully anyway. And so, Joe, I'm appreciative of you for this conversation, but also broadly for your ministry, and I appreciate you taking the time today, brother.
Thank you for all of that, but I'm just trying to slog along. So,
well,
thank you.
From an outsider's perspective, you're doing great, brother. So, friends, we're going to draw a conclusion to this, but if you like this sort of conversation, if you want to support the kind of work that I'm doing here on PlainSpoken, I want to urge you to go to plainspoken.locals.com and sign up for my community there. And if you want to financially support it, that makes it so that I can do more stuff like this and I can hire on TJ full-time. So consider doing that, but even if you don't, just pray for me and for PlainSpoken that we continue to lift up voices that otherwise don't get heard and share good information that helps people make good decisions. So thanks for joining us. And
wonderful service you're doing here, Jeffrey. Thank you.
I appreciate you, Joe. Thank you. All right, friends, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
All right.